So welcome to the Fair Share Summit. We conceptualized the summit a long time ago because we realized that there were a few gaps in the Canadian climate movement. And so the goals of this conference are to build on a critical internationalism within our climate movement here in Canada, recognizing that our local, regional, and national struggles are stronger with an international lens. Because as we move one step forward in Canada, we move many steps backward internationally as our government engages in very sometimes irresponsible and destructive ways in the international community. And as we know, climate change knows no borders. If we save ourselves here, we don't ultimately save ourselves at all if we don't look to a broader international lens. So the conference covers a few major pillars of achieving a global climate transformation. Yesterday, we covered climate finance. We had a fantastic panel that covered sort of the main issues in climate finance and the work that's been done to determine Canada's fair share of climate finance. Yesterday, we also had an amazing panel on tax justice and trade justice, these really big, thorny concepts that were broken down so beautifully by our panelists. And today, we're tackling financial institutions and debt. Something that we don't have a lot of conversations about in our movement, something that seems so opaque, lives in such a black box, and yet holds so much power for unlocking a global energy transformation and for unlocking climate justice. And so really, really happy that we have our two incredible panelists here to demystify some of these issues for us. I would love to welcome our two panelists, and I'll just read their bios right now. So we have Mariana Paoli, who is the Global Advocacy Lead at Christian Aid, which is an international organization. Mariana is from Brazil, and she's Christian Aid's Global Advocacy Lead. She has 20 years of experience in policy, advocacy, and campaigning. She leads on advocacy and climate and economic justice issues related to global processes. She coordinates Christian Aid's work at the COP climate summits and has attended numerous UN climate talks. And she also coordinates the Climate Finance Working Group of Climate Action Network International. And I think she just returned from some IMF meetings. Before working at Christian Aid, she worked for Greenpeace's international, UK, and Brazil offices. Mariana holds an MSc in International Political Economy from the London School of Economics and a BA in International Relations from the Catholic University in Sao Paulo. And she currently lives in Brighton in the UK. So a big warm welcome to Mariana Paoli. Our second panelist is Victor Menotti, who is the US coordinator of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice and also senior fellow at the Oakland Institute in California. He is based in Bratislava, Slovakia, where he's calling in from. So it's 6 p.m. for Victor right now. Thank you for being here with us. He has advised developing and developed country governments, small producers in farming, fishing, and forestry sectors, as well as labor unions, indigenous peoples organizations, and environmental groups on global rulemaking for natural resources in trade, investment, finance, and technology policies. Since 2007, he's also been deeply involved in global climate negotiations at the UNFCCC. And Victor and I go way back, and he's been a mentor and a friend for many years. It's taught me so much about the international justice space. So today, I'm so thrilled to hear from both of you today. And so before we dive in to the content, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So one thing is that we're recording. I mentioned that before. For those of you who just came in, we're recording the session, and the first hour will be shared on our website. Through these talks, we really, these are new ideas for so many of us. These are unexplored ideas for so many of us. And we want to use the summit as a starting point to get really messy and engaged with these ideas. So there's a number of ways in which you can do that. Number one, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It might be hidden under the More button. And please ask any question. There is no question too dumb. We may or may not get to the questions, but as the conference organizers were gathering them, and we're taking note of the areas of knowledge that people want to explore more. So please do ask your questions. We have a little thing called a Padlet, and it's an online note-taking space where you can put all kinds of thoughts, questions, um, memes, photos, documents, ideas, where just musings, anything you want. Like we said, get messy, use the Padlet, and engage with what other people have put in there as well. And at the second half of this session, this is a 2-hour session. We might end a little bit early, but the second half of the session is an interactive participatory workshop that's led by Shake Up the Establishment. And in that session, we'll be engaging with the ideas. Mariana and Victor will be there for at least part, if not whole of it, and we'll be able to actually play with the ideas that they talked about. We'll be able to see what other people are thinking about. We'll be able to ask more questions and identify, hopefully, some areas that we can move forward with, and start to build some power around, build some unity around going forward as Canadian movements. Last but not least, we have some community guidelines. Since we are sharing a virtual space, and we need to sort of renegotiate those boundaries of respect and accountability together. So we do have community guidelines and a statement of values that we're going to pop in the chat very shortly. There we go. Thanks so much, Doug. And please do adhere to those for the duration of the session. Okay. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to ask Mariana to take over from here. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Mariana Paoli. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Anjali, and hello, everyone. It's a really great pleasure to be participating with you today and share some thoughts. And I'm actually really pleased that I'm calling from Thornhill in Ontario, where I'm visiting family. We're just coming back from the World Bank and IMF annuals. So yeah, I prepared some slides which I'm going to share, and of course the presentation will be available for you as well after this. So let me just share my screen 1 sec. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So fantastic. So first, I just wanted to start with the big picture, where the conversation from climate and debt is coming from. And this is very much acknowledging that the international financial system is not delivering for the people and the planet, and especially to address the multiple crises of the growing poverty, inequality, and ecological crisis. And this is very much linked with the fact that the global south face a constrained fiscal space due to the debt crisis. It's really expensive for them to make new loans, the high cost of capital. They face the tax dodging problems, tax evasion, tax avoidance, etc., and a system that privilege private finance and is distorted against them. At the same time, we have the growing needs in terms of finance, both from the Sustainable Development Goals as well as climate-related spending. Estimates vary that there is at least 5.8 to 5.9 trillion US dollar needed by 2030 to meet the national determined contributions, which is benchmarks that countries established so that for us to keep underneath the 1.5 degrees, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we know that it's not really lack of money. The money is out there. What's missing is really political will. When you compare, for example, the NATO countries are spending more than 2% of their GDPs on military spending, vis-a-vis, for example, on climate spending, OECD DAC is only 0.30. 3%. So a really, big difference in terms of what are the priorities and the political will. Now, one thing that I feel like I'm a broken record, but really essential to all our work we do on climate justice, on economic justice, on debt justice, on gender justice, is really about the centrality of public finance for climate and development action at the core. And this is really what has been missing throughout. It was key element missing on COP28 is essential for COP29 and beyond. And when we talk about public finance, we're talking about that new and additional grants-based finance. And it's really a contradiction from a lot of what developed countries and multilateral development banks have been pushing forward on private finance. We know that private finance is insufficient and limited for mitigation. If it often neglects adaptation and is completely inadequate for loss and damage. And we know that the public finance and public finance at scale, which is what is needed, must be grounded on the principles, but the common, but different responsibilities and capabilities. Is about equity, it's about reparations, it's about the climate debt owed by the global north to the global south, and provide its fair share of funding. The global north must repay its climate debt. So it's really important in our work to really counter the narratives that the public finance is limited, when we know it's lack of political will, this greater role of the private sector first approaches, and the push for false finance solutions like carbon offset markets, which essentially only allows business as usual to continue, or debt swaps that are inefficient, or insurance, etc. While at the same time, we see developed countries wanting to reopen the discussions on who funds climate action, and reopening the contributor space, wanting developing countries to put more money on the table, while at the same time trying to use climate finance channels dispersed not through UN-based ones where the global south had voice and participation, but reinforcing the role of multilateral development banks, international financial institutions in climate spaces. So the power dynamics are out there. So when you look at the current debt and climate landscape, well, most climate finance is provided in the form of loans. We know that according to UNCTAD, 3.3 trillion people live in countries that are spending more on resourcing the debt than they do so on climate and education. And when we look at the quality of those loans, even like this vast majority is counted as commercial loans. Essentially, climate finance in the form of loans are good business, right, for developed countries and the private sector. And we look at the context of 100 billion from Copenhagen. We know it was unbalanced. It was between adaptation and mitigation, most wanting to mitigation. Most of it as provided as loans. The vast majority of that finance was not new or additional to ODA, and at the same time, completely insufficient in terms of the UN fund channels. Now, when you look about, okay, how can we change that? There has been a lot of, you might have heard about the whole narrative that the World Bank uses about being a bigger and a better bank. And we know that it really doesn't work. So when in the jargon, when you hear that, we need a global architecture reform, what we mean by a global architecture reform is really about transforming the system. It's not about capitalization of the bank. So calling for a fit for purpose system is really about increasing that fiscal space to free up resources. So it's about decrease the focus on loans. It's about ending harmful conditionalities that come with those loans. Is about increasing the transparency and inclusion on the bank. Is about stopping that privilege, the private sector first approaches, stopping no harm, and remembering that, of course, MDBs, especially the World Bank, is still funding a lot of fossil fuels. Bretton Woods institutions, the bank and the fund were created in 1945, and they are controlled by the global north. So we cannot have those institutions being responsible for having the decisions on climate finance where the global south has very little voice and participation. So when the World Bank says, climate finance is really trying to portray itself as the biggest provider moving forward across all its finance areas. But I just wanted to call your attention to what these policies actually are. So first, climate agenda has been used as, a green structural agenda. It's essentially what we have seen before in terms of the Wall Street consensus. Is now what's called the Wall Street climate consensus, which essentially is the same like privatizing and liberalizing the energy sector, modifying regulators frameworks to incentivize private investment. It is and the Paris alignment methodology that the bank has a number of problems. So what we have seen before and why it doesn't work in terms of avoiding attracting the private sector investment, we saw it on the billions to trillions agenda that the bank released in 2017 that did not attract the right amount of investments. And the most importantly, we cannot rely on private sector market forces to drive the green transformation that we need on energy, let alone the fact that there are no bankable projects in adaptation or loss and damage. These are like public goods, and when we look at the landscape, for example, Africa received less than 2% of the global renewable energy investment. So we cannot just let the markets deal with this. So achieving the fiscal space for climate justice, it's really about overhauling this conditionalities. And I would like to call your attention for this publication from PowerShift Africa on what a just energy transition really means. So global architecture reform done right, and I think it's not just between the nexus between that and climate. And I know we had a session on tax yesterday. But what we are really fighting for is an architecture that addresses, the tax dodging, and it's great. We have the establishment of a UN tax convention is underway. It's being negotiated under the UN. We need something similar for that. We need an independent debt workout mechanism, and this could be the focus of financing for development for next year. We need to enable the state to regulate private investments in ways that are oriented towards development. We need transformation through economic diversification and promoting distributive macroeconomic policies. So it's a group of different elements that need to be coming together. Next July is the 4th Financing for Development Conference happening, where we will have a great opportunity to plant the seed for a UN debt workout mechanism. Not just looking at debt cancellation, but principles of responsible lending, increasing the transparency on that, having public registries. So there is a number of reforms that could be done to really address the roots of that, especially as 2025 is the year for the Jubilee. So that brings me, I think, to the question of what is being discussed at COP, the new collective quantified goal, because again, those private sector first approaches and more climate finance in the forms of loans are on the central stage. So at COP, we really need this new collective quantified goal that has to be agreed to be, new, additional, adequate, predictable, needs-based, rights responsive, and concession in form of public finance to meet the needs of the convention. I think I'm probably going a bit over my time, but just wanted to also mention, go a bit more in that why, you know, that swaps are wrong solutions for climate, and very much on the forefront, especially worrying is that they're legitimizing a lot of illegitimate debt. They don't create new funds, and they are really a distraction from what is currently needed. Later on, I think we could touch a bit more on Bridgetown and a few differences between the different versions, but I think I will, in the interest of time, I will stop here. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I think definitely there's so many follow-up questions that you touched on so much there that I think a lot of folks will want to watch this recording back. Particularly interested in asking you about Bridgetown a little bit later. I'm going to pass to Victor next to give some remarks. So Victor, take it away. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anjali. Hello, everybody. And thank you to Mariana for setting the table so nicely. Right, just again to my role is with the global campaign to demand climate justice. And I'm sort of the representative in the COP space as the constituency focal point for DCJ. But I also wear the hat of US coordinator, because DCJ being a network, sort of the counterpart to Climate Action Network in the ENGO space, that's the environmental NGO space at the COP, Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is really led by groups from the Global South. And so there are strong demands for debt cancellation and sort of popular analyses of debt that DCJ is really oriented around. And in fact, some of DCJ's origins were around trying to fight for space and attention for these issues in the COP discussion. So I feel like I also need to back up a step and maybe introduce or reintroduce something that might have been discussed yesterday about climate debt, because maybe before we talk about the whole challenge of developing countries' debt and how they deal with climate change, I think it's important to set straight the record about who actually owes the debt and who is in debt, and particularly in the context of climate. And by that, I want to talk just a moment about historical responsibility, because I understand it was talked about yesterday, but in the context of the global climate talks, historical responsibility refers to those countries who have a long history of historical emissions and must take responsibility for taking more than their fair share of atmospheric space. So yeah, being from California, and our audience here, I think Canadian, the way the UN breaks it down is looking at different regions. And because they don't want to call out specific countries, you'll see in the most recent IPCC report, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their AR6 report on mitigation came out last year. It showed which regions are responsible for what portion of emissions since 1850. And so Canada and the US, North America, are 4% of the global population is actually responsible for about 24% of the global emissions since 1850. 4% responsible for 24%. Now compare that to South Asia, which has 25% of the global population, but responsible for only 4% of the emissions. So, and South Asia includes India, most populous country on the planet, Pakistan, all of those countries, 25%, 4%. You may ask, what about China? Often in the US, we get that question. Well, China, since 1850, still has only about half of the US historical emissions. And that's with 4 times the population of the US. So what you have in the COP space is a dynamic where developing countries, in demanding climate justice, aren't just fighting for like their fair share of the shrinking carbon budget, which we know is about gone. There's just scraps there, and that frames the debate wrongly, we feel. But feeding into the fair shares framework, which I understand you all are working towards, what's Canada's fair share? And as our experience in the US in defining that fair share, we talk about the fair share of the global effort to keep warming within 1.5 degrees, which implies that there are the necessary provision of finance and technology, because the US and Canada have been major polluters over time. And we've taken more than our fair share of the atmospheric space. So to correct that, we have to do more than the global average of emission cuts. The US looks at the IPCC recommends that countries would cut about 50% by 2030. So the US has a pledge, a target of about 50% by 2030, but it's not enough for the biggest historical emitters to do the global average. We have to do much more than that to meet our fair share. So I feel like that's an important frame to set. And what folks from the Global South call it is climate debt, maybe a term that you've heard before, but it's that the developed countries from the Global North owe a climate debt to the Global South because we've taken up more than our fair share of the atmospheric space, and it's going to cost more for them to make the transition to adapt to the climate impacts, let alone the loss and damage that they're already experiencing now. So, and you may see various assessments of what that debt is. But recently this year, in the run-up to COP29, what we have is a call by Global South groups, but it's been picked up internationally in what's called the Pay Up campaign, which is an effort to escalate our efforts towards COP29, where the big decision will be on a decision for a new collective quantified goal, the NCQG. I would just like to share my screen a little bit in a moment while I keep talking here. Yeah, just I think to help frame the discussion around the climate debt and a very real number of that 5 trillion, which Global South groups are calling for. And I can share also some of the survey, the literature of what that 5 trillion number is based on. But let me also talk a little bit, or at least show if I'm sharing my, am I sharing my screen now? Yeah, so this Pay Up campaign is actually calling for, it includes DCJ, it includes CAN, it includes the women and gender constituency, it includes indigenous peoples and trade unions, and really almost all the UN constituencies that are rights-based are teaming up in this Pay Up campaign. And we're calling for a global day of action on November 15th and 16th. And here I'm just, I hope you can see this. I'm showing a slideshow of planning for the Global Day of Action. Here you can see some of the main calls and demands. And the top one there is delivery of climate finance of at least 5 trillion annually as reparations for climate debt. Now, that's not necessarily our ask in the NCQG discussions, but it is helping to frame that debate so that the North knows really what the scale of need and what the scale of delivering climate justice looks like. And then also a few bullet points down, I think you can see second from the bottom, talk specifically about unconditional debt cancellation for climate and economic justice, which Mariana touched on. And I'll also mention that, there are a lot of debt justice groups within DCJ. One of our anchor organizations in Asia is the Asia People's Movement on Debt and Development. I believe you can Google them at apmdd.org to see how, really people's movements from the Global South who have also come into the climate space and are changing the shape of civil society demands and analyses in the COP space. So I also wanted to share some of the those specific demands that DCJ has had over the years, coming from back as early as 2010. It's restoring the global South's atmospheric space that's occupied by the North global greenhouse gas emissions, implies a decolonization of the atmosphere through reduction and absorption of their emissions, assuming the cost of the technology transfer needs of developing countries, assuming the responsibility for billions of people forced to migrate due to the climate crisis, and eliminating restrictive immigration policies, and lastly, providing full delivery of adequate non-debt creating and equitable climate finance. That's what the NCQG debate in Baku for COP29 will be all about. I also wanted to share here, what is this? I wanted to share a joint submission from the debt justice groups who have formed together with climate groups, a debt and climate working group, and together have prepared a joint submission to the technical expert dialogue for the new collective quantified goal. And I can drop this link into that into the chat here for folks to download this. But briefly, you can see some of the recommendations here. It's about debt implications needing to be further analyzed to be able to understand and set a proper goal. Secondly, the NCQG guaranteeing a provision of grant-based finance that's not creating more debt. Thirdly, all climate finance must be responding to the needs and priorities of the various vulnerable communities and frontline communities. 4 is, again, about not further indebting developing countries with climate finance instruments, and that even grants and highly concessional finance should form a majority of the public finance under the NCQG. Mariana has been at these high-level meetings, and I'll let to talk more about that. I won't go over all of these, as you can see, so many of them. But again, I will drop this into the chat at the end when I'm done, so folks can see that. I also wanted to share another resource, and that is because you all are doing your Fair Share Canada, what your contribution should be, just to share experiences with those of us in the other part of North America, the US. We have put together a US Fair Share NDC. Here's the PDF. I can drop that in the chat as well. But debt cancellation is part of that, not only for developing countries in terms of what sort of policy changes the US can do, but also for domestic communities impacted by climate and extreme weather, and that folks at the national level should receive debt cancellation in trying to rebuild their home, rebuild their business, basically recover from the loss and damage of the increasing extreme weather. And let's see, I just hope that we can, I'd like to invite more collaboration between those of you in Canada who are preparing your Fair Share NDC and how you push for it. These, of course, are the NDC's nationally determined contributions are the core pillars that make up the Paris Agreement. It's what every country must contribute in terms of climate action. It's important that it's not only mitigation, what countries are doing to cut their emissions, but for countries like Canada and the US, developed countries who have the most historical responsibility, how we're providing the finance and technology to the global South, to developing countries, to help them make the transition as well. And maybe one last resource to share is I recently drafted in collaboration with the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty, a toolkit for policymakers, elected officials, members of parliament, members of Congress, on what measures need to be taken at the national level for phasing out fossil fuels. And of course, it's not just canceling leases and winding down production, but there are also a number of measures that national governments can take when it comes to global economic governance and the international policies that our national governments take that are needed to transition from fossil fuels. And at the top of those, of course, is debt cancellation and dealing with what some people call the fossil fuels debt trap. And that's, you see it, for instance, with Ecuador. Many developing countries who are reliant on producing fossil fuels and took more and more debt on to be able to drill more, produce more, and then find themselves having to drill more and produce more to be able to pay off the interest of the loans that they've taken on. So they get caught in this cycle of being unable to pay off their debt and having to drill more and more to be able to pay off more and more debt, and can't get out of that debt fossil fuel trap. Anjali, I'm just seeing the clock here, and I think we're about the time where for me to shut up and move on and go to the discussion. So one last thing I do want to share is I'm not sure, what we can do in North America in terms of getting our governments to advance debt cancellation, because I know we're going to have a discussion after this. And the Canadian context, I hope, is different from the US. But, what we found is that it's not so much our federal government where, well, there's a lot that they can do in terms of providing debt cancellation. And, even like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has, one of the most progressive positions on climate and progressive policies, needs to be pushed a little bit more than just accepting the IMF recommendations, which is what she's done so far. But we also find, at least in our context, it's at the state level where we need to push our governments. Wall Street, right, biggest center of capital on the planet, is regulated more by the state of New York than by Washington. So when it comes to reconciling debt, there's legislation we're supporting, and some of our members trying to move in the state of New York, that when countries come into debt reconciliation, debt restructuring negotiations with creditor countries like the US, like Canada, that it will force the private debtors, the Citibanks, the Royal Bank of Canada, JP Morgan, those big creditors, private creditors, to the table as well to help reconcile that debt. Because we don't want governments to cancel debt and then let the big banks off the hook and not allow them and not force them to also cancel debt. So I'm not sure what the Canadian counterpart is to that. And maybe there is draft legislation already, but this is where the debt justice and the climate justice movements can come together concretely and also collaborate. Thanks very much, Anjali, for inviting me to share today.
Wow, thank you so much, Victor. You covered so much ground and you gave us so many great resources, because obviously we can't learn about this whole, nuanced topic in one session. So having these resources is really helpful. Thank you, Mariana, as well. I want to bring us all into the room together and dig a little bit more into some of the stuff you talked about. So there's a few things. Let's keep going on this debt trap conversation, because I think it's really rich. And when I think of the debt traps, I think of, I can give a recent example that I was just looking at that for folks who are here in the room might help illustrate some of what Victor was talking about. In 2019, there was a massive cyclone across the east coast of Africa called Cyclone Idai, and the majority of the devastation hit Mozambique. And there was, millions and millions of dollars of devastation and infrastructure loss. And, this is unfortunately a familiar story. I'm describing one example that has repeated itself so many times. The Mozambique was a colony, a Portuguese colony, and had a lot of compounded debt from their post-independence period. So they already owed the IMF millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. And Cyclone Idai hit, caused all this infrastructure loss, and they had to borrow another 118 million from the IMF on top of their existing post-colonial debt. And so I think to me, that example, obviously there are so many others, and I invite you to share any other examples as well. That example kind of brings together all of the issues. Why are developing countries under this burden of post-colonial debt to begin with? And how the climate crisis interacts with that already broken system. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to the role of the IMF and the World Bank specifically in creating these debt traps at just a really basic level, creating situations like Mozambique, like Pakistan, like the Philippines. Like, I mean, every major climate disaster that hits causes all of these causes these debt traps to deepen. And yeah, so just interested in that big picture analysis. And I'm not sure who would like to start with that. Maybe Mariana?
Sure, I can give it a go. I guess the main problem, as you correctly pointed, is that the system is skewed towards this powerful nation in terms of the decision making. And when we look at, for example, when there was the Jubilee debt in the G7 in 2005, there was a lot of debt cancellation, etc. And to the fact that we fast forward nearly 20 years, and against the developing countries, the debt trap and the debt problem is even worse, is because the mechanisms that create the debt were not addressed to begin with. And the problem is those institutions, which in theory, the World Bank should focus on development, and we think development should really be thinking in terms of what kind of finance is needed for different situations. And that's where, for example, when you look at even the IDA, which is the arm of the bank that is geared towards the least developed countries, the low income countries, the vast majority is not just come with debts, but with the conditionalities and fiscal consolidation. 85% of the world's population is under austerity measures at this point. Is really which really brings us to a cycle that if you reduce money from education, from health, from social spending, etc., if you remove the role of the state, then you will really enable more forces for the private capital to come, and you actually can actually repay your debt, when in fact you need to spend more to ensure your development. So it is a trap, because countries cannot really address their needs on the right way. They need to borrow more, and the cost of capital increases more and more. And this is actually getting, the COVID made it worse. Climate change is making making it even worse, and the tools, and even the new tools that are being used, are making it even worse. For example, you might have heard about SDRs, the special drawing rights, which were used during the pandemic, which essentially it's kind of like free money that can boost liquidity when countries need the most. There's lots of conversations of using this type of money through the IMF for climate change. And the way to do that, they created something called the RST, the Resilient Sustainability Trust, which is again looking at, it doesn't have to be through loans, they could be grants. And it could be, and again, they are dispersing this money through loans with this green conditionalities attached, and asking for more, fiscal consolidation and austerity. So the main problem at the core of the bank and the fund is this whole, Washington Street type of operation. In terms of making the tools for private sector is about blended finance, is about the risking, is about lending. What is the role of public finance for grants? Where is the needs for, looking at the mini investments versus micro? This is just not there. It's about the big macroeconomic issue that yeah, we have to face that. I don't know, Victor, you.
Victor, do you have anything to add onto that?
Maybe just to give kind of a different angle or another dimension of debt. I saw in the chat something and your reaction, Anjali, about the debt, the Mozambique example. But I'm just, I hope this can be visible to you all. I put in the chat. It's just a screenshot I got from Bloomberg TV on Monday, and it shows U.S. versus Saudi Arabia's oil output. And you can see over recent years, what was it, maybe 2014, the U.S. Got up to the level of Saudi Arabia and then went down again, but then early in the Trump years surpassed Saudi Arabia. And you can see the big drop there, that was COVID, but then the U.S. just kept chugging along. And even under Biden, the U.S. is now at record oil output. We're pumping more oil than any country ever on the planet. And so, of course, again, you know, Canada and the U.S., thanks to the Canada-U.S. trade agreement from 20 years ago, is really, you know, one production unit, almost so much U.S. and international investment there. But I think the point is that much of the growth right now in oil expansion, fossil fuel expansion, is coming from the richest countries, from the US, from Canada, and from some of the non-OPEC countries. So how this relates to debt is that Saudi Arabia, believe it or not, is trying to diversify from oil. It has a Vision 2030. You know, after years of denial, of course, it still tries to delay action, but they do have a plan, and they are desperate for international investment and to diversify their economy. Now, their plan is not really the best plan, and in my view, I could explain why, but they do have a plan. They are trying to diversify, but you can see how the overproduction by the US, and I would put Canada in this category as well, is driving down oil prices. That makes the income that countries who are dependent on the fossil fuels and trying to diversify, makes it more difficult for them to transition, because then they just don't have the revenue they need to diversify their economy into non-oil activities. So much so that Saudi, despite all of its production, has had to go to the debt markets. This year alone has issued debt for $50 billion that they're plowing into their diversification program. So, you know, they've got a balance sheet where they might be able to manage it a little bit better than Mozambique or Ecuador. But it just tells you where the overproduction by our North American producers is driving other countries to take on debt to try to do their transition.
Mm-hmm. Mariana, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, just one point is specifically on the IMF. It's currently actually encouraging 11 developing countries to continue pumping their oil to be able to pay for their debt. So even developing countries who desperately need a just energy transition, who really need to diversify their economies to get out of that, you know, the fossil fuel trap, you know, those institutions are not helping. And then when it had countries saying, you know, wait a minute, no, I do not want to keep exploring my oil for my development, like Colombia recently, or Ecuador, for example, the markets reacted in a negative way. The rating was it a score?
Credit rating agencies.
Yeah, that's the credit agency of those countries. You know, got worse, which shows how the system is broken to address the debt and the climate crisis.
I think that last thing you brought up is so important. Just to make that really clear for everyone who's listening, Ecuador made an announcement. Was it the president or the finance minister who announced a phase out of fossil fuels? So, you know, trying to do the right thing, taking national leadership on climate. They're going to phase out fossil fuels. And immediately after, their credit rating on the global markets was lowered. Their currency was devalued. They got essentially immediately punished by the global financial system for doing the right thing on climate. And so that's, I think, really strikes to the heart of why we're even tackling a topic as huge as this, because it's a major block to leadership around the world being able to stick their necks out to do the right thing on climate. And that's why I think it's more on us than ever before as a powerful G7 country, and us as movements within that powerful G7 country, because Canada is not going to be punished in the same way as Ecuador if we stick our necks out to take climate leadership. And so there's a huge role for the G7 countries to play. I do want to ask, we have a question from the audience, so I'll just read it out, and then whoever wants to take it. Okay, so a question from Beth. She says, I'm also interested in learning about the connections around what countries are having to resort to instead of borrowing. I know foreign direct investment has been a huge challenge for global South countries, where foreign countries are building highways, airports, conservation areas, etc., and taking majority ownership over that infrastructure. And this is seen as less favorable than borrowing because of the oppressive conditions. Is it further eroding their ownership of revenue generating assets that could support climate investments? So talking about foreign ownership of assets within a country. Who wants to tackle that?
Should I take that, or Victor, do you want to? Okay, I think foreign direct investments, they have two major problems. It's not just the the foreign ownership, but the question the fact that they tend to prioritize large scale infrastructure, larger scale type of investments. Normally, when you look from a climate perspective, it could be one on renewables, but honestly, like renewable energy on larger scale for export that displace communities, and that's it's grab lands, etc., is not done right. And the one risk that we have in terms of this approach, in terms of a few big projects vis-a-vis the small projects that benefit communities, is one problem. The second one is that to attract foreign direct investment, that means providing the enabling environments, and enabling environments means lower labor standards, mean really not adhering to a number of policies that actually are hindering, not helping the communities that live on the ground, let alone the question of ownership. So and to be honest, sometimes when a company wants to invest in a given country, it doesn't need the subsidies, it doesn't need that enabling environment. So not all investments are the same. So normally it's they're not. Are they preferable than borrowing? Not necessarily. They come with a number of problems as well.
Okay. Did you want to add to that, Victor? Or no? Okay, perfect. I want to ask one last question, and this is going to really set us up for the discussion. What we're trying to get to with the summit is for us to be able to understand the shape of the beast. What are the main structural issues here that are preventing a global energy transition? And more specifically, what is our role? First of all, what is Canada's role? What is Canada doing to actively block progress? And then one level below that, what can we do as the Canadian climate movement to push our governments on specific areas? So we don't have to get into specifics today, but the goal is eventually to arrive at specific policy levers that we can push on as Canadian climate movements. There was something really inspiring that happened in 2022, and it was something called a Bridgetown proposal. And I want to ask you about Bridgetown. So for those of you who don't know what Bridgetown is, Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of Barbados, and she's this amazing leader. And she proposed a package of reforms in 2022, essentially recognizing exactly all the things we've been talking about, that even if developing countries do their best to do the right thing, to transition, to participate in a global energy transition, they have they face much higher barriers than a rich country like Canada. They face these higher borrowing rates, they face crippling debt burdens, they face a very slanted and unequal global financial system. And so the Bridgetown proposal was essentially a package of reforms that would seek to unlock climate action by tackling these financial barriers. There have been obviously various issues with Bridgetown. It has gone through various iterations. I believe we're on version 3 now. Can you give a brief overview of what is the Bridgetown proposal? What value do you see in it? And is there anything that that we could sort of attach ourselves to as the Canadian climate movement within Bridgetown?
I could start off. Just noting the time, though, I see it's just at the top of the hour, and just wondering how much time do we have? Because you gave a very good overview right there, I think.
Yes, so we're going to be transitioning into the participatory part of our session in a few minutes.
Okay.
I think that a little bit of discussion of Bridgetown will actually set us up really well for that, and then we can take those actual solutions-oriented ideas and discuss them in the participatory session. So it's all good.
Just to build off what you outlined there, the package of reforms, there were many of them, but I think some of them were very kind of oh duh, like things that should happen already, like when countries have extreme weather disasters and can't meet their debt obligations because electricity has been knocked out for 6 months, and say the ports are closed down because of storm damage, and therefore there's no export revenue, that countries could have their debt payments, their requirement to meet its debt payments, have those suspended for some time, for 6 months, for a year, for something like. So things that seem kind of like, shouldn't that happen anyway, are things that are proposed as sort of reforms in the Bridgetown. But then there are others that I guess we see as problematic because they open the door to more debt instruments being used for climate finance. The emphasis, the Demand Climate Justice's call has always been that climate finance needs to be grant-based. It needs to not drive countries into deeper debt. But yet, one of the big critiques about Bridgetown that I think a lot of folks share is that it, even calling for concessional loans at very low, below market rates, still can create debt for some countries. You might say, oh, the payments will be so low over time, but not necessarily. And it's not, it's like the analogy is, used to have a neighbor upstairs in San Francisco, and he left the bathtub on one night after drinking and flooded us out. And it's like, rather than paying us back for the damage done, imagine, if he wanted to, like, oh, don't have the money, but I can lend you the money for the damage that I did to the property, and you can pay me back and I'll make interest on it. Yeah, it's like that sort of logic is still what the idea of a loan for climate damages is built on. So, and I think Motley is I think really a leader. If you see her recent speech at the UN General Assembly in September, I think she really is one of the leading global voices right now. Her key advisor on this, though, is, I think, a City of London guy who she's been close colleagues with for some time, Avinash Pernod. So I'm concerned that there's a bit of an orientation that's a little too comfortable with the culture of capital, and meeting its needs. But I think even he has become critical by the reactions that they're getting, and in the formation of the new loss and damage fund, was even gave some surprising public comments about how the debt instrument still being used in some of those things. So
okay, thank you.
to add the like one minute on Bridgetown, I mean, I agree. I mean, the Bridgetown has had a number of problems. I understand where they're coming from. Barbados is not eligible for like concessional loans the same way that other low-income countries are. It's a tax haven, and has a much more. The Bridgetown came with a much more that market-based approach. Like, and I remember Avinash saying public, like, I don't care where the money come from. When a disaster hits Barbados tomorrow, I need the money, and I'm going to pay for whatever price. Is it for which is not anchored on justice or equity or any of the agendas in terms of transforming the system. So Bridgetown tried to be okay, how to make the system without challenging how the system works, and that's why things that are, in my opinion, obscene, like loans for adaptation, were there on the first version, and even in Avinash mentions like the loss and damage shouldn't be part of this new collective quantified goal to be agreed at COP, because we need grants for loss and damage, and that shouldn't be part of it. So I think, yeah, Bridgetown has been a bit of distraction. Having said that, the third 3.0 version is a bit better, but it still is not ambitious enough. Just to give you two examples, it talks about the role of tax, for example, on tax on importance to tackle it right, but doesn't support the UN Tax Convention. It talks also about the new issuing of SDRs, but it doesn't talk about how those SDRs should be allocated in a more equitable way, because the current way it doesn't really work.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you so much. That's a really good overview of a good critical overview of Bridgetown. So the other thing that I would love for us to take into this next segment is the concept of a debt jubilee. Mariana, you talked about the previous debt jubilee. What year was it?
2005.
2005. And we had some. Yeah,
no, sorry. Jubilees to 2000 is every 25 years. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Right, because the next one is next year, right?
Yeah.
So the Jubilee is, I think, originally a biblical concept, and it's the concept of debt forgiveness. And there's a lot of, in Canada, we have had debt cancellation movements before. They've been led by the churches. We had Beth Lorimer from Kairos here, who is leading a campaign for a debt jubilee next year with churches across Canada. It's a fascinating concept for us in the climate movement to think about. So perhaps we can take that into the discussion in the next segment.